Hello everyone, my name is Bahriye Kemal, and on behalf of Kent Refugee Help, I would like to welcome you to our event today, Seeking Sanctuary, Mental Health, Space, Papers in the Hostile Environment. For those of you who don't know Kent Refugee Help, just to say a little bit about who we are. Kent Refugee Help is a small user-led charity now in its 14th year. Our main focus is working with foreign national prisoners in London and Kent prison establishments. Some of our clients are in prison under immigration laws, being deemed too high risk to be placed in removal centres. Others may be refugees, former unaccompanied minors, EU migrants, those with long residence who come to the UK fleeing human rights violations with their parents when they were very young, people who are undocumented, or stateless. All are trying to navigate the complex legal systems they are caught up in with very little help or advice available. Many of them are facing deportation at the end of their sentence without legal representation. We are here, there to listen and take forward in whatever way is appropriate for each client. During the year 2021, it was no longer safe to go into prisons because of the pandemic, so we continue to support foreign national prisoners and people who have been released remotely. We also have complex ongoing work with several former detainees from DIRC, the Dover Immigration Removal Centre. Today's event has been inspired and shaped by the work we at Kent Refugee Help have been doing, as well as the work that legal experts, medical experts and psychiatrists, campaigners and renowned poets have been doing and have witnessed during the pandemic. We have been witness to deeply disturbing struggles that have been experienced by vulnerable, undocumented and destitute people. A pandemic response that refuses human beings the right to a safe environment, the right to healthcare, the right to spacious living, the right to food, the right to income to survive the pandemic. We have witnessed the ill treatment and containment of human beings, the truth of surviving without papers, and the impacts that it has had on mental health. We have also been witness to a new immigration plan from our government. Today, we will discuss all of what we have witnessed for the past year and past years. We will explore the legal, social, spatial, and psychological challenges experienced by refugees, asylum seekers, and those without immigration status from various shocking and disturbing and upsetting perspectives, which will be divided into 5 parts, as you can see in the screen. So we'll start with Kent Refugee Help, our wonderful caseworkers who have inspired and shaped our topic for today, Kate Adams, Raga Gibril, and Pete Keenan, who will talk about our work in relation to prison casework, as well as the legal project, the new immigration plans, and the work we have done and our response to the work at the Napier Barracks, where vulnerable people have been contained. Just to sum it up, but you'll hear more, 200 people caught COVID and 7 attempted suicide, but a lot more will be said. From there will be followed by a legal response to this situation, a roundtable discussion by fantastic barristers from Downty Street Chambers, Leonie and Shi Shu Shin Luo, who will speak about legal responses and links to NGOs. Thirdly, we'll move on to a fantastic presentation by Cornelius Katona, who will speak about the mental links to the situation. From there, campaigning. So Faith Noba from Status Now for All will talk about campaigning against this situation. And then finally, we will end with reading, screenings and talks on lived experiences that have been shared, that I've worked with Right to the Life group, Freedom from Torture. There will be mainly screenings. and ending with introducing our new patron, the renowned Anthony Anaxaguru, who will also read his own poetry and poem by torture survivors. Just to also say at the end of the session, we will have Q&A, but do feel free to put any questions or comments into the chat box throughout the session, but we will aim to have the discussion at the end, half an hour. During the session as well, throughout the session, please keep an eye on your chat box, because what we will be doing is putting links to ways that we can respond, work against the shocking conditions that you will hear about, including the Napier Barracks, and you can see on your screens on the 24th of May, there will be a protest, empty the barracks, close the camps. We'll also share our response to the new immigration plans, as well as a letter that we have composed for those of you who are in Canterbury and Whitstable to sign if you so wish, or you can copy the letter and send it to your own MPs wherever you are located. So thank you so much again for being here. I'm absolutely delighted now to move on and introduce each of our speakers. Each speaker, groups of 5, will have about 10 to 15 minutes, I'd say. So now I'd like to introduce our Kent Refugee Help caseworkers who have inspired today's topic through their hard work throughout the year: Kate Adams, Raga Gibril, and Pete Keenan, who will discuss our casework, talk about the legal project that we have been doing, talk about the new immigration plan, as well as the Napier Barracks. So over to you. Okay, if you'd like to start.
Am I starting?
If you'd like to, whoever, yep.
Yeah, okay, thank you, yeah. Can everyone hear me? Okay, yeah?
You can, Kate.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so I coordinate the prison project, the support for foreign national prisoners, which has been running since 2014. So I just wanted to kind of put our work into context and also mention a little bit about Napier Barracks, but actually that's not been my main work, but it's kind of, it's affected my work. So I was going to say a little bit about that, and then more about the foreign national prisoners, and a little bit about the new plan for immigration, which we've made a submission to the Home Office contesting, along with many other NGOs. And I'd just like to thank all the people I work with as well. You know, we've got a fantastic legal team now, a voluntary, and also we've got funding for legal aid, not legal aid, sorry, but legal advisors, and many volunteers. We've got a legal volunteer, Catherine Carpenter, who's helped me so much, and our clients, because I really feel like it's a partnership with those people, and they make every day in my life special, you know, fighting for them. So just to say really that the year in which we're reviewing our work, March 2020 to March 2021, has been a dark and troubled year. COVID began March 2020, you know, well, it began before then, but we locked down then. And in March 2021, we were still in lockdown. During that time, people of colour have died, and you know, the key workers, nurses, the bus drivers. I think that's really highlighted the situation for everyone who's kind of different, vulnerable, and deprived through structural racism. Doreen Lawrence wrote a report, An Unavoidable Crisis, about this, highlighting this issue about the pandemic, how vulnerable migrants and Black and ethnic minority people were. And then the government brought out a report which kind of totally disputed this, saying there's no structural racism. We know that's not true. Black Lives Matter tell us that's not true. But I think the situation for refugees and migrants was only really came to the forefront with the crisis about these placements in ex-military sites for the people at Penally and Napier Barracks. And Napier Barracks is kind of on our patch, two of the people who are kind of caseworkers, so that's their area. What I would say was fantastic in such a dark year is the kind of spontaneous reaction from activists, from lawyers, from journalists, from local people, from everyone who were outraged by the people, you know, the treatment of these people, not being able to self-isolate, not being able to get healthcare, just treated like criminals. And that really gave me heart. And that's the way forward, you know, to fight together with this, all of us, you know, everyone has a part to play. So my part in trying to support people in Napier Barracks was I went to a political meeting and I asked for our MP, the one that we've written to, Rosie Duffield, to raise a question in Parliament and also send out a statement condemning this placement. And I was told at that meeting that this wasn't an emergency. I was trying to get an emergency motion through because it had been going on for a long time. So I said, actually, this is a political situation. This is an emergency. People on hunger strike are on hunger strike. They were on hunger strike and they were in the snow and they couldn't go inside because they were so scared of catching COVID. And I said, you know, this is people who've got no agency and this is their only political solution and we must find a political solution. So from that, I was granted a meeting with my MP and she did write to Priti Patel and she did press release that these barracks should close with immediate effect. And she did ask a question in Parliament about the involvement of private companies in housing these people, like Clear Spring. So she did well there, and we're asking more from her now in that letter. So Napier Barracks really opened a window, the campaign around Napier Barracks and Penelli Barracks opened a window into the situation for refugees and migrants. I mean, and just to say that we're supporting the campaign for status now as well, which we've got a speaker here today, Faith, from that, which is about indefinite leave to remain, the demand for indefinite leave to remain for all undocumented migrants in this pandemic, because nobody is safe until everyone's safe. And we've got clients released from prison who've got no recourse to public funds, and the churches and other places where they received support from and food have shut down in the pandemic. So that is so important, that campaign. I do urge you to support it. But the window hasn't really opened on the situation for people in prison. And the situation in people for prison exactly mirrored really the situation in the Napier Barracks. I would receive phone calls, you know, during all these lockdowns from people who are saying, we're absolutely terrified. There's someone in my cell, I think they've got COVID, the cell is dirty. We can't go to our English classes anymore. We can't work, so we can't, it's really difficult to get the money to phone you. There's no legal advice in the prison. There are no legal aid surgeries in these prisons. And so people are saying, we haven't got a lawyer, we've got a deportation issue, you know, and all this is invisible. I'm hoping that what's happened with Napier Barracks is going to mean that we can actually shine light on these problems as well. Some of my clients have actually become mentally ill during this COVID crisis. A client who I've been working with for a long, long time went back into prison, and this is the cycle of people's lives. Prison, detention, deportation, avoiding deportation, getting out, back into prison. This client went into prison because he tried to burn down his house, because he's mentally ill, I think, but it wasn't recognised and treated in prison. When he was released, he was psychotic. I knew he was psychotic because of the kind of things he was saying to me. He was saying, I want to go into hospital. I don't know who I am anymore. But he didn't actually get that help at the time. And then he messed up and he was recalled to prison. Now his immigration lawyer has realised he's mentally ill. Well, I actually knew that before, but I do know him very well. So now I'm really pushing the lawyer to try and get the help he needs, and the probation officer, you know, it's devastating. I've known him since 2006. He really doesn't know who he is anymore. It's so upsetting. And that's what prison does to people, you know, and they're not really bad people. They're people who've made mistakes, just like any of us. And then they're punished by this double punishment of deportation. And that's really something that we've got to contest and fight as well. That is exemplified in the case for Osim Brown, who's a young man who's Jamaican with learning disabilities I can't remember the other condition because I'm nervous speaking. But anyway, he totally relies on his family care. Autism, thank you. And his mother, Joan Martin, has been leading that campaign, just in the way Doreen Lawrence campaigned for her deceased son, you know, not supported by the police. She's been leading the campaign for him to stay in the UK. And I understand now an immigration judge has asked the Home Office to review their decision, but he was convicted to deport him. He was convicted under joint enterprise, which has now been totally discredited. His family believes that he's absolutely innocent. He was convicted because he was vulnerable. He didn't get the appropriate legal support at the time. And he's going to die if he returns to Jamaica. So that campaign exemplifies why the double punishment of deportation must end. There has been a High Court case about the lack of advice for immigration detainees in prison, and bail for immigration detainees were very much involved in that case. And I think the judgment says that it's discriminatory and it breaches Article 14 rights. I don't know what they are, but I'm sure a lawyer here can tell us. So that's an important step forward. Catherine Carpenter, our legal volunteer, has been helping me with the Detention Forum to produce a paper, along with other NGOs, to raise that point about the lack of legal advice and support for people, mostly the priorities people facing deportation. And we believe that people should get advice and representation support right from the beginning. You know, someone needs to look at their immigration case right from the beginning. At the moment, there's nothing, there's nobody. But a high spot in our lives is that we got a grant of 20,000 from the Community Justice Fund. I couldn't believe that we got this fund, this money. I couldn't believe it. We never had so much money in our lives. So we've been actually able to fund 2 lawyers to run a telephone advice line giving immigration advice, and actually provide video link sessions for people. And we're not constricted in the way legal aid is. So if people need a top-up session, our legal advisor, Auntie, who was one of our trustees and stepped down to do this work, which is fantastic, and then recruited a colleague, is able to give them another session. And so they kind of have like a bespoke plan for contesting their situation. But we can't actually take on the cases. We're not set up to do that. But we're in a much better position to refer now, to get lawyers. And we've got a couple of lawyers now who are taking cases from us. I tell you, this is just amazing. And we've applied for more money as well. We've been invited to apply for more money. I learned at a meeting of these groups that had been awarding this money. There are other, groups giving legal advice in the community. That's what it's for. I learned from an ILPA presentation that 500,000 people have been denied legal aid since 2012. The Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment Offenders Act brought in those cuts to legal aid, which have denied foreign prisoners the right to legal aid to challenge their cases on the basis of having family and children here, a private life and medical issues and that kind of thing. So that is so damning, isn't it, of our system? Just to say, finally, that we've made this submission to the new plan for immigration. Now, I was asked to say something about this. I'm not a lawyer, so I find it quite difficult. I'm hoping actually Andrew might be going to say something, is a lawyer. But we really concentrated on 4 things in this iniquitous plan, which like really affect our work. So the outlawing of asylum seekers by saying that claims by people who come via clandestine routes are illegal. We're actually meeting people now in prison who've been convicted of trafficking offences, who are coming in those small crafts with other people. And I just learned from a lawyer that their asylum claims might be rejected because of that. And these people are just completely terrified and disorientated. They don't have the language. They've come from Iran. They don't understand the criminal justice system. Maybe they weren't properly represented. Criminalizing claims from asylum seekers and changing the whole basis of asylum claims is so wrong. And it's lent power to the far right. Who've attacked asylum seekers in Napier Barracks and harassed them in Penally. The restrictions on bail and raising the threshold for people claiming to be trafficking by implying that they're fraudulent. Andrew has submitted some expert evidence on that. And scrapping the provision of support for refused asylum seekers So many of our clients are refused asylum seekers, as well as actually being asylum seekers. So they come into that, they come into that category. And asking local authorities to collaborate with removals and deportations. This is so disgusting. And apparently this is actually part of the 2016 hostile environment laws that was never implemented because the local authorities refused to actually collaborate. And I hope they will do that again, because this is so shameful. And making bail bail conditions, making bail less possible for people if they've not complied with immigration control. Just to give an example of how difficult it is to comply with immigration control, I had a young client who just got married, his partner was expecting, he really didn't want to travel to report in case he got COVID, and he got ill from traveling to report, so he couldn't report. And then his wife and baby had to actually move out and go somewhere else, completely devastated his life. And that's how the hostile environment affects people, those unreasonable and iniquitous demands. And just to end with a quote from Freedom from Torture, the NGO that has been so much to the forefront of contesting what's happening in these military barracks. I'm really proud of them. They seem to have really quite changed direction recently. And I think that's partly because they're led by someone with lived experience, which is also such an important thing. And they've just said that the way the Home Office is dealing with things equates to patterns of equivalent behaviour in states around the world that refugees report to them. In other words, the Home Office is actually behaving like torturers. So we've asked our MP Rosie Duffield to raise her voice in Parliament against this and to stand with us and with refugees and migrants and to be part of this struggle. We'll win it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you so much. What you'll see in the chat is a link to a brief of our response that was prepared by Andrew Jordan, our trustee, together with Catherine Carpenter and Kate Adams, a brief response as a PDF. And you will also see a Google Drive document of our letter to the MP, to our MP, Canterbury and Whitstable, requesting that she reject this new plan in government. If you are from Canterbury and Whitstable and you too are with us in rejecting this proposal, please do sign the document. Don't edit the letter itself, just put your signature. If you are not from Canterbury and Whitstable, but you too are against this plan, then feel free to copy this letter and send it to your own MP in your own area. Now I'll hand you over to Raga, who will say a few words about her casework, Napier Barracks. Raga, are you around? I did see you, if you want to unmute yourself.
Good morning, everybody. I'm quite struggling with my internet today.
Okay.
So I'll keep it brief.
Okay.
Is in all honesty, is most of the kind of the situation I come across it is being covered by my colleague Kate Adams. So we see very much similar situations. I mean, if I can only add something, it's just some of the kind of cases which is we come across through Napier is what you can call is the culture of disbelief and denial always. We come across young people who are actually they might be very obvious they're very young, but their age being contested, and with the whole thing is young people going through a horrific journey across deserts, across hostile countries, and when they get to this country, they're already kind of traumatized, and then they have to deal with a system that they have no clue exactly where to start with. I mean, they're not even aware of their rights, and not to have you know, access to support or, you know, just kind of people with understanding, so they could actually just help them to kind of, you know, figure out their way. Issues of lack of access to mental health support, lack of access to even physical support sometimes is, you know, I mean, it's, I'm just kind of talking about the case of Napier here. There is a nurse on the center or at the barracks, but it takes quite a lot of things to kind of get someone to explain his kind of situation, health issues, what they're complaining about, especially when they are confused. I have forwarded something which has been sent by one of my colleagues from Care for Cali, Sally, today, and I hope you could actually share it with our meeting later. Yeah. You know, I covered people in prison, in detentions, over the phones, and it does most of the time left us as well feeling hopeless, if I can say. You know, but yeah, I guess an environment like this environment is kind of a beginning to kind of, for every one of us to be able to kind of share things and you know, share our learnings and see what we can do to help the people at such circumstances. I mean, just imagine most of the kind of new arrival at the barracks at the moment, not aware as well. They even deny them that just where you're going to be taken to, for how long, and why. You know, they're able to provide a taxi driver for quite a lengthy of traveling across towns to bring people from Midlands to Kent, and just not to have the kind of the decency of telling them that we are actually transporting you to Kent, to this place, and for these reasons. And though we are being told this is not a detention, but very much it does actually have all the kind of, you know, the definition of a detention, if not a prison. Thank you.
Thank you, Raja. Did you want to say anything about Sandra Anderson's case that we discussed last year, who was caught up in the Windrush scandal and forced to leave to Jamaica? You've been in touch. I know Pete may.
Yes.
Maybe Pete's going to say something, or would you like to say a few words about that?
Well, it's the immigration is a complex thing, as most of people here might actually recognize. Sometimes people come to this country in a sponsorship, like as family, and unfortunately, some of the people sometimes end up in the prison system for one reason or another. Even if you have driving problems, or you know, whatever the cause, if your husband is sponsored and he end up in prison, you lost your living in this country. And if you have children at school or this and that, it's their future is in. So the case of Sandra basically is a similar case of someone who's actually come to this country with her family, and she had a daughter. She was at university, and she suddenly kind of been, you know, found themselves in that situation. Father in prison, they're not able to know which prison is it. They kept transferring him from one place to another place. They ended up deporting him, and you know, COVID-19 hit. The mothers and daughters, they had COVID. Mother was working in a nursing home, helping people who with all sort of things, earning, you know. So when she was COVID patient, she had not sufficient money even to look after herself. Anyway, Kent Refugee Help helped us through it. There is kind of materials we shared on previous kind of documentation, and I really can't thank my colleague P. Keenan enough for handling the the complex, actually, kind of communication with the Home Office. Sometimes you have to kind of be calm and do what you have to do. And we helped her to go back home. I leave the rest of it to be covered. She is still struggling. She went back to her country. It was as hostile as here as well because of COVID. Yeah.
Wonderful.
I leave it to be covered by, if any, but feel free to ask if you wanted to ask anything later. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Raja. And over to you, Pete.
Hi there, everybody. Yeah, thanks a lot, Raga, for that. And Raga's put a really nice basic background report on the situation with Sandra in the within the our AGM document, which Barria and others very well got put together. I really recommend anybody who hasn't read it to go through that, because it's a really comprehensive piece of work on what we have been doing and the context of what we've been doing. First of all, as Raga's just been talking about Sandra, I actually managed to get through to Sandra on the phone last night in Jamaica, and this is the great joy of WhatsApp for following up on clients for all the years that people have disappeared into the void, and really you just can't get any feedback, but we do have that ability now. So you can feel the struggles that are really going on. And so, I mean, Sandra, what we've tried to do with Sandra, having actually helped her to negotiate the Home Office and getting her back home in as nice and human a way as possible, she's then in a situation where she's basically sharing a one-bedroom flat, her son's one-bedroom flat, with her and her daughter, and his minimal income. And we've tried to establish her to set up a little business, a home food supply business, which again, because of COVID restrictions, has been difficult to get off the ground. She lost her phone for a month, so I've been very worried about her, and somebody's stolen it, and she's now got a temporary one. But basically, we are actually able to do a follow-up with her, which is terrific to feel that we can do that, and it's a real new development in some ways. But she's managing, but the restrictions over there in terms of COVID are appalling. They've got curfews, so even her little come and pick up food that we make and do a sort of home delivery, people can't do that. It will pick up, and it's just like we're there to do the kind of supportive stuff in the meantime. But moving on from that, the Napier issue, which has been really completely a major focus for me over the last year, since it was originally opened as an alternative accommodation basis, because the Home Office, all of this is led by the government. This is political stuff going on here, which has become more and more apparent to me as the year has gone on. The Home Office, everybody was basically really shocked when it was first done. Local Tory MPs, everybody. And, amazingly, I found that there was no actual hostility to refugees. It was just shock that this had been suddenly foisted upon everybody. So we negotiated that early on. And we got involved initially I was involved in a sort of a positive protest outside the camp against far-right people who were actually objecting to people being shut up in what was visually, and still remains visually, very, very similar to the concentration camps in appearance and in layout that you might have seen in some Second World War imagery. It's shockingly so. And when I first was standing outside this barracks, and I was thinking, my God, when this gets out into the media, into the press, it's going to be such a backlash against the government action in putting people in these places that they won't last. They won't last. In fact, what became more and more clear to me was that the government was very, very happy to have this imagery out there as a PR exercise, addressing the base level of some of their electoral supporters, encouraging the hostility to refugees, to immigrants of any kind. And they were quite happy to live behind this facade. This was not, they didn't see that as a problem. And that became more and more apparent. We initially, we tried to take myself in collaboration with Samphire Project. We used to work with taking a legal mentoring project into the detention center in Dover before it closed. we went in there hoping to negotiate via the SESPM, which is the Kent Basic Immigration Front for how immigration is handled in Kent. It was an online Zoom program, and we went along to this with the idea that we're going to negotiate, get a space where we could have face-to-face, secure exchanges with people in the barracks, and to see it as a silver lining to what was the word iniquitous, as Kate was using earlier. It comes back to me more and more as time has gone by in relation to Napier and the consultation process and the immigration law that's being attempted to be foisted upon us all. But it's became more and more obvious that we were in trying to negotiate this, that the risks of COVID were always in the background there. But we thought, okay, we've got all these people in one place, we'll be able to do something really positive rather than being scattered around the country in the houses where they normally would be pre-COVID. Here is an opportunity in the middle of this thing. It became very difficult to do that, and over time, we had a case. I've got this in my report in the AGM, but it became obvious suddenly that there was a real risk of an outbreak of COVID. And 6 weeks before this, in meetings, I was raising this from the rooftops in these SPM meetings with Home Office, Clear Springs, all the rest. Nothing happened, absolutely nothing. Subsequently, major outbreak, and protest from the quite strong protest from burning around the barracks from the residents, which I definitely would have been amongst those people, you know, because it's a petri dish, basically, my images of that for the spreading of disease in the time when everybody else, all other normal citizens, were being pressurized to socially distance. So that at that point, absolutely, my whole mindset changed, and the campaigning aspect of getting out there and saying this is immoral, this is inhumane, it's in breach of basic international human rights legislation, and this can't go on. Much to my horror, people were actually all moved out. All the over 300 people were moved out in the first cohort. Then subsequently, they were moved out, and they've moved over 200 people back in now. Back in the face of that, in the face of the major outbreak. I mean, the callous inhumanity is almost unbelievable. It's just beyond belief. But anyway, so that's been my perspective. I've got the greatest respect for Care for Calais, and Sally, I think, is in the meeting here, and all the terrific work they've done on the ground with people, supporting the JRs that have people with the JRs that have come out, successful JRs. There's the ongoing, there's the public, but basically describe it as public interest JR, which is currently running, and the judgment will be coming through from that. It's hard to see how the government is going to get past that, because I can't believe that they can come to any other conclusions than the individual JRs come to. So we keep our fingers crossed and hope that Britain doesn't become an absolute international pariah, because at the moment it's certainly showing all the signs of being exactly that. Moving just quickly on to some of my individual cases, which I've run on from days of past. Friends of mine who are in prison now, and I say they're friends, they've been clients for so long, they are friends. It's a kind of, KRH is a family, and basically our clients eventually become part of that, and they can be just as awkward as my family members and just as in need at different times. And my understanding of the prison side has been massively increased over these last 2 years with one of my clients who's a friend who's now subject to 23-hour lockdown, is physically disabled under the most appalling pressures, and he manages to hold it together just about. But I'm learning about prison law, particular prison law support which needed. I'm pleased to see that Rupert, one of our trustees from Doughty Chambers, was saying positively that he had there are colleagues who specialize in prison law, because it's such a for me, and it's, you know, trying to find out what's going on behind a parole date which is being kicked constantly into the long grass. He's been re-detained, he's back in prison after a supposed breach of bail conditions, which is highly arguable from a legal perspective. But he's going to be in there for 8 months, 9 months before he even gets the opportunity to house it. And this is with a parole, a prison law solicitor representing him. But yeah, so that's that. Sandra is just amazing in her resilience in Jamaica. Raga and I have picked up on, met a refugee friend who's in Folkestone, and we managed to, again, through connections and over the years, the networking thing with solicitors and knowing solicitors is just terrific, because her position was not great in the light of her country of origin, which wasn't one on the a subscribed list of places that people couldn't be returned to. And we managed to get somebody really good solicitor supporting her, and she's got a case running now. So, you know, there's plenty of opportunities out there within the prison and in the in our daily connection, which is what makes it feel like a really strong Kentish organisation. And we have got a local identity, where Napier, which is iconic for the whole of Britain, is so important for us down here to be part of. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Pete. Thank you, Kate, Pete, Raja, for your excellent presentations and showcasing your amazing work and the amazing work that we at Kent Refugee Help are doing. As you could see in the chat box, we've posted on Saturday, the 22nd of May. I think you typed September, but it's May. There's a protest at the Napier Barracks from 2 to 6 p.m. that's been organised by coalition of NGOs to close the camps. So thanks again. So we've set the foundation of who we, Kent Refugee Help, are, and our caseworkers have inspired and triggered our focus on the Napier Barracks today. Now I'm going to move on, and we will move on to a selection of papers and responses. And now I am delighted to introduce our speakers, who will be doing a roundtable discussion with a focused legal response. The topic of the legal response paper is Retriggering Past Trauma and Torture in Napier Barracks, Role of NGO Volunteers to Enable Access to Justice, Support and Evidence Gathering. We have with us today wonderful, amazing experts, Leonie Hurst and Shaw Shin Law from they're barristers from Downty Street Chambers. Unfortunately, Antonio Benfield can't be with us, but I'll just introduce you to Leonie and Shaw Shin. Leonie Hurst is a barrister, as I've said, and has a broad-based civil practice covering a range of areas, including public law, immigration, court of protection law, inquests, mental health, community care and discrimination law. Her work has particular focus on mental capacity and equality issues. She is on the Equality and Human Rights Commission B panel of the Council and is ranked as a leading junior by Chambers and partners in Court of Protection, Immigration and Civil Liberties, and by the Legal 500 in Civil Liberties. Shaw Shin Law is also barrister at Downty Street Chambers. Shaw Shin practices in all areas of public law. Her practice has a strong human rights, civil liberties, and anti-discrimination focus. Her expertise covers a broad range of subject matters, including community care, mental health, and mental capacity in the context of immigration detention and the Court of Protection. She pursues significant public interest litigations on behalf of individuals and organisations. So thank you so much both for being here. They will be doing a roundtable discussion. Feel free to post any questions or comments into the chat box. Over to you, Leona and Shaw Shin. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting us to speak, and sorry that Antonio can't join us today. what we'd plan to do is for me to just give you a quick overview of what we've been doing in relation to Napier and the background to the judicial review claim, which was heard in April and which we're awaiting judgment in. And then to just talk about some of the legal problems that come up. And then Shushin is going to address how NGO volunteers have really enabled that claim to be brought and enabled the asylum seekers at Napier to access justice and to get access to lawyers. So I know that some of you will be very, very familiar with Napier and how it came about, but briefly, what happened was that in March last year, the Secretary of State decided that people were not going to be required to move on from asylum accommodation when their appeals were decided or when their claims were decided. And what that did was lead to a massive backlog and a shortage of asylum accommodation. And the Home Office took a view that it was going to use 2 military barracks sites, Napier and another site in Wales called Penally, as asylum accommodation. And normally what happens is people come into initial accommodation for a short period and then they're moved into dispersal accommodation once their claims are being considered. But in fact, what we've seen at Napier is that people are staying in the barracks for very long periods of time, often months at a time. Napier opened, as you're aware, late September last year, and it opened, as Peter said, with very little notice to either to the local authority or to any of the health authorities in enclave. So there was less than 2 weeks notice between the Home Office indicating that they were going to use the site and the first asylum seekers arriving on the 21st of September. And the numbers grew very rapidly. So by January, there were just under 400 people in the camp. And the majority of those are people who had very, very difficult journeys through the Horn of Africa in particular. There was a very high prevalence of mental health problems, very high prevalence of people who'd experienced trafficking, who'd been detained and tortured during the journey, as well as problems that they'd experienced in their country of origin. So it was very, very vulnerable population, even by comparison with other asylum seeking groups. And most of the refugees at Napier didn't have access to solicitors, and some of them had immigration lawyers, but not anyone who could bring a public law claim or challenge the conditions of their accommodation at Napier. So what started to happen was that NGOs working in the camp, including in particular Care for Calais, I know Sally's on the call, started to refer lots of people who were in Napier to public law solicitors who could help them. And we started to bring claims for judicial review challenging the basis on which they were kept at Napier. And quite a lot of people were transferred by the Home Office in response to letters before action, but some of them weren't. And what eventually happened was that 6 individuals had claims that were linked together, and those were heard in a judicial review claim by a High Court judge in mid-April. We're still waiting for judgment on that, so what we can say about that is a bit limited. But briefly, the legal problems that come up in the case are to do with the conditions that Napier has imposed on people accommodated there, but also the process by which people come into Napier. So we were claiming that the use of Napier as asylum accommodation for destitute people is not it breaches the Secretary of State's duty under Section 95 of the 99 Act to provide adequate accommodation, because it's not a standard of living which is dignified or humane. And it also breaches people's human rights. So in particular, the lack of COVID safety, people's inability to shield themselves from COVID, to socially distance, the extent to which infection was rife in the camp, certainly by mid-January, was really both a public health issue, in response to which the Home Office did very little, but also it itself exacerbated mental health problems that people had as a result of being at the camp, because the anxiety and distress caused by seeing people very ill around you, being unable to protect yourself, was acute. So we also claimed that it had breached people's right to life under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, but also that the conditions of the camp in general breached people's right to private life. They breached their right to privacy, their right to have solitude and quiet conditions. The conditions of the camp are not very hygienic. And so there were lots of separate issues to do with the quality and adequacy of the living conditions. And then part of the claim relates to the process by which people were allocated to Napier. And broadly speaking, the Home Office is allocating people to Napier, or certainly was at that time, without really knowing very much about them. So people were arriving usually by small boats and being put up in hotels for a quarantine period, and then sometimes for weeks or months after that, and then being transferred to Napier in the autumn of last year. But the Home Office recognises that Napier is not suitable for people who are vulnerable. So that includes people who've got mental health problems, who've had past experiences of torture or trafficking. And the real problem is that there's no proper process for identifying people with those factors. And so what you have, and what we saw, was that there were a lot of people who were held in the camp who should never have been there. But there were also, because of the conditions of the camp, people who developed vulnerability while they were there. So it was extremely stressful. We saw a lot of people developing mental health problems who hadn't particularly had them before. So that was the basis of the claim. And I know that Cornelius Catona will talk about mental health as a particular issue in the camps. But the other issue that came up in the claims was the extent to which people were being effectively detained in the camp. So there was, for a long period of time, a curfew. People were told that they couldn't leave after 10 p.m. at night. They had to be back in the camp by then. And they were also told that they couldn't leave for more than 1 or 2 hours at a time. But then subsequently, once the COVID-19 pandemic really broke out, asylum seekers were confined to the particular dormitory block. So they were being effectively held in a dormitory with 14 people sharing showers and toilets in circumstances that were very distressing for a lot of people and felt very unsafe. So that's the basis for the claim that's been heard and is waiting judgment. In response largely to the COVID pandemic, again, you probably know, the Home Office has been moving people out, and by the beginning of April, the camp was empty. But what they're now doing is moving people back in. So we're seeing some of the same issues arising, but also there's been a move to start interviewing people in relation to their asylum claim whilst they're still at Napier. And we're also seeing some of the asylum claims being ruled inadmissible, which means that the Home Office is not going to give them even a cursory consideration, and potentially means that people can be denied an in-country right of appeal against the refusal of their claim. So that's what we've been doing as lawyers, and I think Shushin's now going to talk about the role that NGO volunteers have played in assisting us to bring the claim.
Thank you, Leonie. As Leonie said, one of the challenges of doing this litigation was that information wasn't flowing out very easily, because people were essentially being told that they couldn't leave the barracks. And so from our perspective, in understanding what's actually happening, in gathering evidence to put everything in context, it was absolutely essential from our perspective that NGOs were working on the ground, feeding the information. And what was really extraordinary, because although the clients could give their own accounts, what was really extraordinary was the ability of the NGOs to corroborate a lot of what is being said by individual clients, partly because of an incredible WhatsApp group that seems to be operating where, and I don't know how people manage 800 people on a WhatsApp group, but it was extraordinary. We got loads of feeds of videos, pictures, and ongoing information about a very fast moving situation. And particularly during the period of time in January to March, when there was a massive COVID outbreak, where information was just very confused. There were mixed messages. The ability of NGOs to be able to verify a lot of the information, get the information from a variety of different sources, was really useful from our perspective as lawyers pulling together the cases, and being able to essentially being a little bit ahead of the Home Office in terms of the responses. And when they raise issues, we were able to respond quite quickly with what the actual picture was on happening on the ground. And part of that was because the Home Office, in our litigation, we realized that they had never really visited the Napier Barracks. And so really the information, and the only information out there reflecting what was happening on the ground, was from the NGOs and was from the individuals. And because no one could go in the camps, it was also because of the NGOs that a lot of the people in the barracks were able to access lawyers to help them get out of the camps. And although we had 6 clients, which eventually went to the court hearing, there were, I certainly am aware between our solicitors firms, many, many more people who didn't have to actually go to court in order to get an order to get removed, because the momentum was there in January for the Home Office to actually have to do something. And so I think in our view, a lot of the pressure and a lot of the work done by the NGOs created and made it possible for us as lawyers to actually advance the case in court, but also gave a lot of momentum and publicity to the issue, and put it in under a spotlight for the prison inspectorate and for the Inspector of Borders and Immigration to eventually go in February to inspect and see what actually was there and document what was there. So I think that's sort of where we think the information and the evidence is going to probably be crucial to how the court is going to determine the claim. So that it's not just about lawyers saying this is right or this is wrong, but what actually is happening on the ground is going to inform how the court makes a judgment, in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those presentations. Leonie, did you want to say anything further?
No, just to really say, I think it's very easy to feel demoralized. These are dark times, as Kate said, but there is a lot that can be done very effectively. Judicial review is a very powerful tool to bring justice, and I really want to just say to everyone, it is efforts of organisations like this that enable justice to be done, and so I don't want anyone to lose heart. We're looking at some very difficult consultations, and the new plan for immigration and the immigration bill, I think, are going to be shockers. But we will, there's always fights to be had, and there's always cases to be brought. And generally, the courts are still very fair and very open to suggestions or open to arguments that the Home Office is acting unlawfully. So I really want to just say to people, don't lose heart. We continue to fight the good fight.
Lovely, thank you. And though we will focus on questions at the end, we did have a few specific questions. So Jess Brett has said that her friend's been taken to the barracks recently without sufficient notice and was not told where he was being taken. Is this legal?
That seems to be happening a lot, and particularly for the asylum seekers being moved since the beginning of April. They've been given very little notice and not much information about where they're going. Some that I have seen have been told they are moving to private accommodation, self-contained accommodation. One person was given an address and then was taken to Napier. Unfortunately, it does seem to be legal, because the way in which asylum accommodation is provided is on a no choice basis. So the asylum seeker has no ability to influence that decision, and it is basically just being conveyed wherever the Home Office decides to put him or her. But it definitely is adding to people's stress, and it has led to some real difficulties where asylum seekers who should never be in dormitory barracks accommodation are told that they're being taken to one place and then turn up to this place that does look exactly like a prison, and that can really trigger re-traumatization for people who've been previously detained. I have a client at the moment who was imprisoned in Syria, and the sight and the feeling and the atmosphere of Napier are really difficult for him to deal with, and causing him to be feel very very depressed and very scared. So yeah, it's unfortunately, I don't think that there's anything we can do about that particular bit, but what we can do is continue to try and focus the claims on the way in which the Home Office is making these decisions and the basis for it. And yeah, Kate.
I was just going to add that I mean, you know, the idea in principle, it is a no choice basis, but obviously the Home Office, as Leonie already said earlier, has a process for identifying people who may or may not be suitable to be allocated into the barracks. So there are questions, therefore, of the decision making for the specific allocation to the barracks, which may be different to ordinary other accommodation. A lot of that is difficult to sort of resist at the point at which they give you notice and they move you. But certainly that's something that in the casework that we are doing, we're seeking to challenge that, particularly if the information wasn't there or properly considered in relation to someone who actually should, as Leonie said, never have been put in the barracks. But in principle, where you're given accommodation by the Home Office is on a no choice basis, subject to various caveats.
Yeah, I think we're potentially at a point of inflection, because as the pandemic has receded a bit in this country, we are seeing now that dispersals and move on decisions are being taken. So the pressure on asylum accommodation should lessen. What's happening, I think, is that the Home Office, having essentially run Napier and Penally as kind of pilot projects, are now deciding to do that formally as accommodation centres, and there's going to be, I think, significant litigation about that in the future.
Lovely, thank you so much. Thank you. We also had a question by Joe that's already been answered, so thank you, Joe, with reference to Ptsd and Boris's attack on legal lawyers who are representing asylum seekers. So we'll move on to our next fantastic presentation now. So thank you so much, and we will have time at the end for further questions.
You're muted, Baria. You're muted, Baria.
Oh, thank you. So what I just wanted to say thank you to Leona and Shushin for their presentations. And if you do have any further questions, we could discuss them at the end. I'd now like to move on to our next excellent presentation that will focus on a medical response, so mental health in immigration detention and contingency accommodation, by Cornelius Katona, Medical Director of Helen Bamba Foundation, which is a human rights charity working with asylum seekers and refugees. And Cornelius is also Honourable Professor in the Division of Psychiatry at University College London. He is the Royal College of Psychiatrists Lead on Refugee and Asylum Mental Health. He was a member of the committee that recently updated the NICE guidance on PTSD. He has published over 250 peer-reviewed papers and written and edited 16 books. In 2019, he was awarded the Royal College of Psychiatrists Honorary Fellowship, the college's highest honour for his outstanding service to psychiatry. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Katona, and I really look forward to experiencing your paper. Please do put any questions you have in the chat box, and they will be answered at the end of the event.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? It's at times like this that I wish that little bio notes had never been written, but anyway, never mind. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to see so many old friends. I started my involvement with asylum seekers and refugees while working in Kent. I still live in Kent, and so it's very nice to see so many of the people I used to work with and several of whom I still work with. What I'm going to try and talk about in the next quarter of an hour is a little bit about the mental health of asylum seekers and refugees, but I will talk a little bit more about detention and about contingency accommodation, such as the barracks, as being in many ways quite similar to prison. So what I'll start with is to say a little bit about some of the consequences of human rights abuse, but also, and this I think is the most important bit, and it's been touched on a lot already, about the importance not only of the adverse experiences people have which lead to them escaping from their countries of origin, but also the difficulties they face on their journeys, and most importantly, from the point of view of this presentation and from the point of view of what we're talking about today, the multiple adversities that many of them continue to experience once in their host country, in this case the UK. I'm going to talk a little bit about our work at the Helen Bamba Foundation, and I'm then going to talk a bit about notions of complex trauma and complex PTSD, and a little bit about possible treatments for that spectrum of conditions. And then finally, I'm going to spend, if I have time, a couple of minutes talking not about our clients, but about us, and about trying to acknowledge how difficult this work is, irrespective of whether we are volunteers, professionals, whether our primary focus is on the law, on healthcare, whatever it might be, even, dare I say it, if one works within the Home Office. Dealing with people who are severely traumatized is stressful and can lead to vicarious trauma and burnout, and we need to look after ourselves. So, how common are mental health problems in asylum seekers and refugees? Well, the research isn't all that good, and it's problematic. And it's problematic because these things are difficult to measure. Diagnosis is a less exact science in psychiatry as it is in some other branches of medicine. Cultural factors play a big part, linguistic factors play a big part. The desire not to disclose mental health issues and distress plays a big part. Despite all those problems, it is pretty clear from the research that has been done that refugees are more likely to have mental health problems than the population from which they come and the population to which they arrive. So this is one example. This is quite an old review of published studies by Fazel and colleagues, published back in 2005, and they reviewed a total of 20 studies which covered nearly 7,000 refugees, and they found that 9% fulfilled criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is about 10 times what one might expect. 5% had major depression. Very few of the studies looked at psychosis, and I'm going to touch on that later, and it's already been touched on in some of the presentations earlier today. But that set of numbers which I've told you is actually lower than what more recent studies have shown. I've just given you an example of a study of people from the former Yugoslavia settled in, I was going to say in countries within the European community, but I can't say that now because they were in Italy and Germany and in the UK, which at the time was in the European community. And what they found was that more than 50% in this group of almost 1,000 people had a significant mental disorder. Most of them had mood disorders, including particularly anxiety disorders, and 1/3 had post-traumatic stress disorder. So very high rates in that quite rigorously carried out study. Why might that be? Well, as I've already touched on, I think one needs to remember that this is a group of people to whom bad things have happened and to whom bad things may continue to happen. So before they set out on their migration journeys, a lot of them will have been subjected to torture or to other inhumane or degrading treatment, including human trafficking, and many more will have been subjected to violence in the context of war. One needs only to think about the people who are refugees from Syria to be painfully reminded of that. People coming all the way to the UK very often have very long and very hazardous journeys, during which they are vulnerable to further ill treatment and exploitation. And some of the other speakers have touched on this, particularly in the context of people who pass, for example, through Libya on their journey, almost invariably will have experienced ill treatment, confinement, exploitation for work, quite often sexual exploitation during the course of that journey. So those are all the things that happen before they get here. What about the things that happen when they arrive here? And what I want you to think about is the experiences that we've already been talking about today through that lens of post-migration stresses. So these are people who have already and continue to endure prolonged separation from their countries and usually from their families. They may experience very prolonged immigration uncertainty, and that uncertainty has itself been shown to have bad effects on mental health and on quality of life. For many years, they are usually, not quite always, but usually not allowed to work. Some of them work illegally, but the great majority don't work, which leads to loss of self-esteem and loss of skills, and may result in destitution. People have difficulty accessing medical care as well as accessing legal protection. One of the few things that they do have relatively good access to is alcohol or illicit drugs, and they may use those because they're the only easily accessible way they have of alleviating their distress. This and their destitution may lead to criminalization. Almost invariably, they will lack a support network when they arrive, and partly because of their mental health problems, they will have more than average difficulty in building up a new support network. One thing that we've touched on quite a lot today is the notion of the hostile environment and the multiple rejection and disbelief that people experience within that, and that itself has major mental health implications. And we also mustn't forget that a lot of people will describe continuing persecution by the intelligence services from their home countries. Sometimes that may be delusional. More often, certainly in my experience, it's absolutely true. And the intelligence services of many countries, and the ones where I've been most involved, include Sri Lanka, Iran, Zimbabwe, where the intelligence services actively monitor the activities of opposition members in exile. So I mentioned in passing that few studies had looked at psychosis illnesses like schizophrenia. And I just wanted to mention one study for reasons that will become evident in a sort of self-aggrandizing way in a moment. But this was a study published about 5 years ago of a very large group of people in Sweden. And they compared 3 subgroups within this cohort of more than 1 million people. Those who were born in Sweden, those who had migrated to Sweden but not as refugees, and those who were refugees. And what they found was that the new onset over a 10-year period of psychosis, so these weren't people who were psychotic at the beginning of the study, they became psychotic during the study. The rates were much higher in the migrants as a whole, and that's a finding that's been replicated many times. People who migrate are more likely to develop psychosis. But the important point in this study was that the refugees had higher rates of psychosis than the other migrants. And the authors of the study hypothesized that that was likely to be due to their severe or repeated exposure to adversity, such as trauma, abuse, socioeconomic disadvantage, discrimination, and social isolation. So the self-aggrandizing bit is that I was lucky enough to be asked to write an editorial about this study. And what I've said in that editorial, sort of partly because I crafted it, it sort of stuck in my head as quite a useful summary of some of the issues. So what I said was that consideration needs to be given to the challenges that asylum seekers face during what is often a prolonged and distressing process. These may include detention, inability to work and resultant de-skilling and loss of self-esteem, destitution, and difficulty in accessing health and social care. And that what was needed was a robust mental health response, which should lie in a combination of clinical vigilance, recognition of vulnerability factors, and above all, a determination to minimize the aggravating effects of post-migration experiences. And I think that notion of a determination to minimize the aggravating effects, and particularly the aggravating mental health effects of post-migration experiences, is pretty much the opposite of what this government is doing. So just turning very briefly to what we do in the organization that I work with, the Helen Bamba Foundation, we support survivors of a wide range of human cruelty, torture, human trafficking, gender-based violence, domestic violence, persecution based on sexual orientation. And we also work with a number of former child soldiers. And the important thing about this, I think, is that what we see is people who have experienced complex, repeated, and prolonged trauma. And one of the things that that means is that they are more rather than less vulnerable to further trauma. And that's perhaps particularly true and relevant in the context of human trafficking, where common sense would tell you that people who have been trafficked will have learned from that experience and will therefore be more careful next time. And unfortunately, the truth is the opposite of that. And the trauma that they have experienced and the disruption of their ability to form normal relationships, the disruption of trust as a result of those experiences, actually makes them more rather than less vulnerable. So what we see, and I've deliberately shown you quite an old slide here, but what we see in the way that I tried to make sense of it in my own head is that we see a lot of people who not only have features that we recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, things around nightmares and flashbacks, avoidant behaviors, being hypervigilant. But in addition to that, we see major problems around trust. We see major problems around autonomy, agency, the ability to make independent decisions. Difficulties with imagining a future for themselves. People who are depressed if you ask them about their future, they will give you a very clear answer. I know that my future is bleak. A lot of the people I see, I ask them the same question: how do you see your future? How do you see yourself in a year or 5 years' time? And they just look blank. They don't understand the question. They're unable to do the mental exercise that requires them to imagine a future for themselves. Often they take inappropriate risks with substances, risks with self-harm, sexual risks, and often they have bodily symptoms for which no specific cause can be found, and often they will dissociate, they will go blank, they will avoid reminders of their trauma by putting their mental selves in a different place. So that's the way that I conceptualized all this. And as the years went by, I found myself in more and more good company, in that there is increasing acceptance of the notion of a particular mental health problem known as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And this has now come into the new International Classification of Diseases, the 11th edition, which was published a couple of years ago and which is going to come into full use, is going to be fully implemented from the beginning of next year, of 2022. And the notion of complex PTSD in ICD-11 is what I said. It is PTSD plus. It's those core symptoms of PTSD, the re-experiencing, the avoidance, and the hyperarousal. But what they've put into the ICD-11 definition is what they term an additional set of clusters of disturbances in self-organization, which are difficulties in regulating emotions, difficulties in regulating relationships, and a profoundly negative concept of the self, seeing oneself as negative, as a source of shame, as a source of guilt, and so on. So it's a complex illness. It requires complex treatment. The current consensus is that what it needs is phased treatment, and people aren't able to benefit fully from trauma-focused treatment until they achieve a sufficient degree of stability. Stability both in their situation, for example, having adequate housing, and for example, having a properly regulated immigration status, or at least perceiving themselves as being on the way towards that, but also having a good understanding of their mental symptoms and having effective strategies for controlling those symptoms in the short term. So that's what's needed in phase one. There's then a range of trauma-focused therapies, trauma-focused CBT, for example, but there's then also a need for a more integrative phase in which gains are consolidated and people are encouraged to integrate or reintegrate into the community in which they live and from which they tend to have been and to have remained isolated while unwell. So just briefly, but perhaps more relevantly to today's discussions, I just wanted to say a little bit about detention. We are not very proud to detain a higher proportion of asylum seekers than any other European country. As I said before, this is a difficult word to use these days, but that's important. We detain more asylum seekers and we detain them for longer. And what's perhaps most particular about how we detain people is that we don't have an upper limit to detention. Detention is associated with a whole set of harms, a diminished set of safety, a diminished set of freedom from harm. Very often it reminds people of the traumas they've experienced in the past. They fear imminent return. They're separated from any support network they have built up. They're separated from continuity of treatment and care. And surprise, surprise, if one looks at people in detention, and I've been involved in some of this study, what one finds is high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, of depression, of anxiety, and of deliberate self-harm. Back in 2013, my colleagues and I in the Royal College of Psychiatrists produced a position statement essentially to the effect that people with mental health problems shouldn't be detained. Since then, the situation has changed dramatically with the 2 Shaw reviews and with the Home Office's response to the first of those reviews, with the introduction of what they call the adults at risk policy, which purported to identify vulnerability better and to ensure that people who were identified as vulnerable weren't detained. Unfortunately, what it also set up was the notion that so-called immigration factors should be weighed up against vulnerability, thereby entitling the Home Office to continue detaining even very vulnerable people if they felt that their immigration history justified it. So we have very recently, just last month, we've published an updated position statement repeating that people with mental disorders should only be detained in very exceptional circumstances, and that alternatives to detention should be considered at all stages. We also emphasize that people in detention should receive the same optimal care and specifically the same mental health care as other people were entitled to within the NHS, but that such optimal care could not be delivered in the detention environment because of the non-therapeutic nature of that setting. We also identified the need for staff in detention centres to have appropriate training and support, both to identify mental illness and to avoid burnout. And finally, we emphasised that the horrible phenomenon which we saw all too often of people deteriorating in detention, then requiring admission to hospital because of their worsening mental health condition, then getting better in hospital only to be put back in the situation which caused their deterioration in the first place. That should stop. So the things that I've said about detention, I think apply in large part and very similarly to contingent accommodation such as the barracks. And I just wanted really to echo some of the concerns that have already been raised, particularly by Leonie and Shushin. The notion that people going into the barracks don't have a proper vulnerability assessment, and mental illness isn't properly identified, and a history of torture or trafficking is often not properly identified. Although these accommodations are somewhat less restrictive than detention, what one needs to set against that is that they have less in the way of healthcare provision and much less in the way of safeguarding. And my experience of people in such accommodation, and again, this echoes what has already been said and very much echoes what I've heard in my discussions, for example, with colleagues at Care for Calais, is that people in Napier Barracks have great difficulty in accessing the healthcare they need for their mental health problems, but also for physical and for dental health problems. There is a lot of documentation, and you've heard about this already, about distress and high rates of deliberate self-harm in the barracks. We've recently completed a review of the evidence about the mental and physical health effects of this sort of semi-prison-like accommodation, refugee camps and the barracks. And not surprisingly, the research evidence suggests that the mental health harms of being placed in such accommodation are very similar to those of being placed in detention. And it's the same people, the people who have previously been traumatized, who tend, and the people who have previous mental health problems, who are most likely to suffer further harm. And there's also evidence that the longer people are in such settings, the worse their mental health becomes. So finally, just a little bit about stress and burnout. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Well, people tend to say that they feel exhausted. They become increasingly cynical towards their clients, towards their colleagues, and they tend to have this overwhelming feeling of overwhelm, of inefficiency, of being unable to do what it is they're trying to do. It tends to be fostered by a culture of overwork, of needing to be best. It's fostered by poor leadership and supervision, by an excessive sense of perfectionism, and most important, by excessive exposure to trauma. And the key notion is this idea of being committed and responsible without being able to do anything effective to deliver that commitment and responsibility, which results in feeling burdened, feeling overwhelmed, and feeling hopeless. And that's important to individuals, but it's also important to organizations, be they NGOs, be it the National Health Service, be it the Home Office. It's going to result in suboptimal client safety and care. It's going to result in people moving on. It's going to result, it's a horrible word, but it's going to result in reduced productivity. So one needs to recognize stress and burnout, both at the level of the organization, however small or however large it is, making mentoring and peer support available, making supervision available, and discouraging people from saying that they're too busy to have such supervision. Making flexible working arrangements more available, and that's one of the things that COVID might have been helpful in. Allowing mental health days as a preventative rather than when it's too late, and avoiding a culture of overwork, avoiding a culture in which I've done more hours than you, therefore I'm better than you. As individuals, we ought to be using the peer support and supervision opportunities available for us and seeing that as a sign of strength rather than of failure. And we need to use simple techniques like mindfulness, stress reduction, and exercise, taking a break, whatever the nature of that break. So in conclusion, the main thing that I want to emphasize is that the post-migration process, the process that asylum seekers and refugees face once they get here, has considerable potential to worsen what may already be quite bad mental health. We need to identify those most at risk early, and ideally we should be working towards a positive alternative to the terrible proposals that the government is putting forward. An asylum process could be envisaged, which is sensitive to mental health needs and vulnerabilities, and that would mitigate this particular risk considerably. We need to be aware of complex PTSD, that it's likely to occur in people who have suffered multiple and repeated trauma. It should be suspected and assessed in people who have been victims of human rights abuses, and it requires comprehensive evaluation of needs and a treatment program based on those needs. And finally, it is about the clients, of course it is, but it's also about you. So look after yourselves, look after each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Katola. That was fantastic. We've got so many statements and questions in the chat box, which we will turn to at the end of the session. I'd now like to turn to a campaigning response to this situation, introducing Faith Norba from Status Now for All, and her paper will focus on Until Everyone is Safe, no one is safe, indefinite leave to remain for all. Faith works for status now for all, which is calling for everyone to be given indefinite leave to remain in the UK and Scotland. Faith has also served as an executive of Burnout, Asylum and Refugee Association for 5 years. She has also just started an amazing action group called Midlands Asylum and Refugee Action Group that's based in the Midlands. She's originally from Africa. Faith has lived in the UK for 8 years, still without status. Faith has endured a life of refusal, fresh claims, refusals, fresh claims in the hostile environment of the Home Office. Thank you so much, Faith, for being here with us today. And I really look forward to listening to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to everyone. As I've been introduced, my name is Faith. I'm from a network called Status Now for All. I first want to talk to you about my experience because I am an asylum seeker. I've been in this country for 8 years. I applied for asylum as soon as I came to this country. So I've always been in the system. I've had numerous refusals, being told that everything that I've written is a lie. I've actually been even questioned if Faith is my real name. I've been questioned about everything that I said in my application, because what happens is once you are refused, you are given a choice of either putting in a fresh claim, or if you want to put an appeal. Now, when you put the fresh claim, you are not supposed to use any information that you've used before, which means you must come up with new information. They teach us to come up with lies because in the beginning, when you come and tell them the proper story. But because they are using their own formula, they don't sit down and listen to people's cases. That's why they regard everybody as a liar. Now, I am blessed with 3 sons who live here in this country with me and 2 granddaughters. The problem is, the challenges that we have is when you have children, they cannot be on their full potential because everything is limited. Whatever is limited for me, I cannot work, I cannot drive, I cannot do so many things. It's the same thing with children. Now, if you're raising children, even if they have talents, they cannot be themselves and use their talents because there's always a block that block asylum seekers. My sons, luckily, they managed to get to university. However, they were not given student finance because they are not British. But through donations and scholarship and offerings here and there at different churches, they managed to get to university. But you ask yourself, once the child has that qualification, has that degree, what is he going to do? Because if I'm not allowed to work, my children are not allowed to work. So you're in a dilemma where must your child continue on education? Remember, he's not going to do anything with his education as long as an asylum seeker. Whether he has a BA degree or he has a BSc or he has A levels, there is nothing that any child can do as long as he's an asylum seeker. Because I'm sitting with all the skills that I have. I'm sitting with all the education that I have. I cannot work. The education that I can get in this country for me is doing English courses, which is something that I've gone way past because that I did in my country before I got here. Now, I'm complaining, I'm living with my children. let us talk about single people. You have a single person who lives alone in this one room. Whether she is in a shared accommodation, she lives alone. Bottom line is when she's finished cooking, she goes to her room and she sits alone. Well, before I unpack there, I just want to play a clip just for 2 minutes for someone who has lived here in this country for 21 years as I'm speaking today. She is now 65 years old. If she's lived here for 21 years, chances are she doesn't know her grandchildren. Chances are she has not seen her children for 21 years. But let's just listen to her before I continue.
Sorry, can you all hear?
Sarah.
No?
Yes.
You can hear this or not?
No.
When I press play now, look.
Thank you very much for calling me.
Okay. Sorry, I just had to check.
Can't hear her.
No sound.
Can't hear, Barrier.
Because you're on mute, Barry. Yeah.
Oh, really? When I mute myself, you can't? Of course you can't. Sorry.
Yeah.
My friend Sarah, thank you very much for calling me for ED. I was stressed in my room. Last night I wanted to die. I had nobody to talk with. I came here, as I told you, 2001. Up to now, I haven't got my paper. It is stressing me. I don't know what to do. Sometimes I feel like killing myself. I don't know what to do, and the money they are giving me is not enough. That's why I'm sick, and I'm already on 20 years. They are not doing anything for me, Sarah. They are not doing anything for me. Every time I cry, day and night, every time I cry, day and night. Now I want you to give me water. I don't know what to do, Sarah. I don't know what to do. I don't know. I'm now running mad. Sometimes I want to eat something good. The money is not enough. I want to eat my country food. I can't buy it with this card. I don't have my people. I don't have people at home. I don't have what. I don't know. I've come to relax my head. Otherwise, if I didn't come, my head was going to be down. They would find me dead in the room. Even when I came, I didn't tell anybody where I was. That's why you see me. I'm like a mad person. I don't know what I can do.
Yes. So she's from Uganda. She's been in this country for 21 years now. She's stressed alone in her room. She gets a card that she can go and do groceries every Monday, but she has never touched cash because she cannot get cash. So she must go and use this card to buy whatever she wants. So which means she's being groomed to be a shopper with a card because you have to use it. If you don't use it and the money accumulates, they stop it. You must remember that. And she is forced to eat on what the shops that she's allowed to buy, because as an African, there's shops for African food, but she can't go by there with this Home Office card because the card will not work there. Now, we have her on the side, and bear in mind, my name is not Sarah, which means she's starting to get to the stage of mental health problems. And she was a speaker when Status Now celebrated a 1-year mile, and she was not in that condition, which means now she's deteriorating. This is now in a space of about 2 months or 3 months because of being locked in the room. Remember, we've just watched a big interview on Oprah where the royals are complaining about being stuck. They're complaining about not having a passport. I've not seen my passport for 8 years, by the way. I don't have my passport, and I can live with that. I'm stuck in this house, but I don't live in a palace. This is not a palace. I don't even have a yard where I can stretch my legs because I'm an asylum seeker. I just want you to understand how people can just complain without realizing the privilege that they have. Like I'm saying now, sometimes I want to complain, but I can't complain because I'm so much better than Miriam. I can go to the other room and talk to my children because my children are here with me. I can go and talk to my grandchildren. Sometimes it's too much for me. I need that time, privacy, where I can be on my own. That is a luxury for me in this place that I'm living. And I'm not in a palace, right? So now, these are the challenges that asylum seekers have, because the life that I'm living now is not my proper life. It's a fake life. I'm not living a fake life because I'm fake. I'm living a fake life because Home Office is made in me, is making me to live like this. Now, it gets to relationships. As I've said to you that my sons are at university. Don't I wish one day to have a daughter-in-law? Yes. Will they get married? My own future is not certain. Will I get married? Does anybody want to marry an asylum seeker? Most probably no. And my children is there any girl, nice girl, who is with them at the same university, who can say, yes, I'll take you even if you're an asylum seeker? Chances are less than 2%. Maybe not at all possible. And then now, you get to the part where you think, will your life ever be normal? There's many times where I wake up, I think, is it worth it to be here in this country? Yes, it's worth it because I can't go back. But don't I wish to just leave and just go? But I can't go back. But it's a wish that sometimes you wish when it's too much, you think, I wish I can just go. Because the conditions are so unbearable. I am a living experience. I'm talking about my everyday life. Anxiety, trauma, fear is my everyday life. Because I don't know, when I hear the knock, I must always worry. Are they deporting me? Are they coming to move me? It's either they move you somewhere or they deport you or God knows what else. The last refusal that I had was telling me that go back to Africa and you'll communicate with your children because there's many ways of communicating on social networks. So I must go, my children can live here, and then I can communicate with them on Facebook. I don't know how, Facebook, I don't know which social network they were talking about. Those are the solutions that we are given by Home Office because they sit there, they don't have a formula of looking at the cases, but they don't want to listen to the real stories because every asylum seeker is a liar, according to them. So mental health is affecting us on a daily basis. Any thing that worries my children, it gets to me, and then it affects me just like that. And then I ask myself, if this stress is too much and one day I don't wake up, what will happen to my children? What will happen to my grandchildren? Will they be deported the next day? What will happen to my body? Will I ever see my firstborn son that I left back at home? These are the questions. These are the things that build up to this fear, build up to the anxiety, and there's no word. There's no one word to say what it is, because it's everything. It's fear, it's anxiety, it's trauma. Everything is built in. And yet we have limited resources where we can go because of this hostile environment. Now, we're in this fight of asylum seekers to win. And every time they keep on changing the laws. Before, people that have lived for 10 years, there used to be a way of them for getting status. That changed. Now it must be 20 years. But is Miriam not here for 21 years? Because they always have to find just a loophole to change everything and tweak everything to suit them, to refuse people. That is what they do. When they get the case, the most thing that they must do is to refuse it at all costs. That is their aim before they even get to the story. So we are suffering in this country. And then now, the only best thing for us is to go through to networks like Status Now for All, because Status Now for All is fighting for everyone, whether you are undocumented, whether you are an asylum seeker, because people get undocumented. Maybe if it wasn't for my children, maybe I would have also just become undocumented, because it's the easiest way of running away and just be not in the system and go and live with a friend and continue with my miserable life. I can't do that because I have children. So that is how people end up being undocumented, because they fight, they don't win, and then they think the next thing, you know what, let me just disappear, which also put them in too much risk, because once you are caught undocumented, it's another big case. So now what Status Now does is it fight for people. Status Now for All has something called signatories, which means there's other organizations that have signed to Status Now. There's over 200 already that have signed to Status Now. They fight for people to get access to the doctor. They fight for people to get legal advice. And there is an early day motion that was already sent to Boris Johnson a year ago, fighting for people to get indefinite leave to remain. Because now, if you get leave to remain and it's not indefinite leave to remain, somewhere along the line, when you've lived the 2.5 years, you need more money to keep on renewing. And where do you get that money? It's too expensive to keep on changing. That is why Status Now for All is fighting for everyone to have indefinite leave to remain, because we've already here. There's nowhere where I can go after 8 years living in this country and go, how can I live my life anyway? My children are already here with me. This is my home. This is where I've been. So it's been a year, no response from Boris Johnson. Now, when Status Now for All finished 1 year, we've done another early day motion, because now there's COVID and COVID is being serious. Parliament does not respond, but the more organizations join Status for Now, we stand a chance of having government do something about it, because they have not done anything, and it's been more than a year now. Status Now has been there for more than a year, and they're fighting for people from UK, everywhere, and people from Ireland as well, because we understand that we too, we are an essential part of creating a public health response to COVID-19 that actually does everything necessary to both stop people becoming infected with the virus and stop people from passing it on. You see what happened in Scotland a few days ago? That's how we're supposed to be. Be united. When something happens to one, everybody else must worry about it. We come together. This is what Scotland did. Now, if organizations can come together under one umbrella and fight with the government in order for people to be documented, in order for people to get indefinite leave to remain, in order for our children to have education, in order for our children to have their own families and have children, we'll have a better life. But until that is done, it's a problem. We have to be positive that this fight, we're all in it and we have to fight, and then we have to fight it to win it. Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years. But he kept on thinking and he kept on saying, it looks impossible until it's done. And he came out of prison. You know why? He had faith that one day he'll come out of prison. He was sentenced to life. They called him a terrorist. But he came out of prison and he changed South Africa for this period that he was out of prison when he was still okay. So how do asylum seekers survive? Just in closing. Now, we all have our own way, our own mechanisms of surviving in anything that we come across. So what works for me? I'll talk about me. I'm a Christian. Strong beliefs. As my name says, faith. I live by faith every day of my life, with a hope that one day I will be accepted in this country, with a hope that one day I can drive a car, with a hope that one day, if a bulb is missing, I can fix it here in this house, with a hope that I can buy myself a double bed and have a better sleep and not sleep in a single bed with my 2 granddaughters, with a hope that one day I can just walk in an office and greet people and meet people and work and contribute in this country because I've lived in this country. But my mechanism is based on my Christian values, because without it, people like Miriam, if she doesn't have God, there's a problem. She says she wants to kill herself. I cannot reach the stage because I have my children that look up to me, and I have children that I'm living for. And for me, it's important to keep this faith and nurture it and believe that one day, with all the fights from all the organizations and Status Now for All, fighting for people, that Home Office will change the rules. And that all, we can all live better and we can all be happy. So it's the faith that keeps me going, because as I'm here, biblically, there's many people that left their countries and went to other countries and they lived. Joseph, good example. He was successful. Even he had people his brothers following him to another country, which was not his country. So what's wrong with me if I'm living here? I've lived here. I decide, okay, let me find a way and bring my granddaughters to live with me, because I wouldn't have seen them for 8 years and it was driving me crazy. So I decided if there's a way, let them come. Then we all become a family here. And that's exactly what we're doing. And I'm raising them every day. Don't do anything wrong. Things will get better. You must just be strong. Just do the best that you can. And that's exactly how it has to be, because one mistake as an asylum seeker, deportation. There's not even a second chance, deportation. So we have to raise children and teach them how to live right. So in closing, and thank you for listening to me, and thanks to all the other speakers as well. There is no formula. There is no formula of people to be given status. the stories that we come with here are the stories that have pushed us to leave our countries. I love my eldest son. I've not seen him for 8 years, and I'm raising his children here. I cannot go through that. If I can still go back there, I wouldn't have done it. But it's because it's impossible. But by faith, we can win this. And by faith, we can live every day and keep hoping and keep hoping and keep hoping until it happens. Solidarity, let us now for all.
Thank you so much, Faith, for that really, really powerful presentation and sharing the video of Miriam. I was just wondering, is there anything we can do to help Miriam? Should we raise some funds, a donation box for us to, whoever would like to kindly donate? Is there anything that we can do to help us 45 people who are here right now? Faith.
Her frustration is that she's on section where she gets a card, where she uses a card. She doesn't get cash, which means she's only given a choice of 4 places where she can shop, or few places where she can shop with a card. So she does not have access to cash because she must only use the card. So which means
set up a donation box right now. Is there something that for us to donate to Status Now? Or would you like me to put the donation that's for Kent Refugee Help and that can go directly to Miriam?
Yes, you can do that. That will be appreciated.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is put the, sorry, I didn't ask Kent Refugee Help team, but I hope that's okay with our trustees. Is that okay, Chris, Andrew, Auntie? Yes, Chelsea says yes.
Yeah, yes, that's fine. That's fine, Baharia.
You'll see the donation details there. All you have to do is click there and put a donation. This is directly to Kent Refugee Help, but if you can put for Miriam, and so our accounts manager and bookkeeper will know that this cash is going to go directly to for Miriam at Status for All. For Miriam at Status for All, please. Your donations are much welcome. Of course, this is one of so many cases, and I wish we could do a lot more, but I would love if we can help Miriam right now. So thank you so much, Faith, for sharing. We're a little bit over time, but I'm not going to go too much into detail now, but I'd like to end with some poetry and some creative work from the Right to the Life, Freedom from Torture group, Right to Life. I'll share one poem. The Right to Life group have shared quite a lot of work, creative pieces with me, and I've been working with them closely for a couple of weeks. However, because we're way over time, I'm only going to say a little bit about them and share one of the poems that they have shared with me. Happy to share more if you'd like, but I understand because we are way over time. Just to tell you a little bit about Right to Life. So Right to Life is Freedom from Torture's creative writing and performing group. It is the longest running refugee writing group in Britain and the only one in the world specifically for survivors of torture. The group provides survivors a safe space to share lived experiences, express their feelings, and develop their voices. The writers from the group have collaborated with the Tate, the V&A, British Museum, and the Roundhouse, and they have worked with a wide array of amazing celebrities and renowned writers to produce high-profile events and publish some outstanding work. In terms of freedom for torture, they stand with survivors, providing therapy and support and fighting for change together. The Right to Life group has been led by Sheila Heyman, novelist and BAFTA-winning documentary filmmaker. And now I'm just going to share a poem by one of the members of the Right to Life group, who has actually worked with us quite a lot throughout our 14 years of being here, Jade, the wonderful Jade Amoli Jackson. She joined the Right to Life group in 2001, and she shared this message with me. She said, I really enjoyed it because it's like home. She says she's really sorry that she can't be here with us, but she is happy that she's had a platform to share her voice here. In terms of the Right to Life, she says, in normal times, we're fed a delicious meal. Now, thanks to the supporters, we each have a laptop so we can join the workshops via Zoom. And I love every minute of it, she says. Jade Amoli Jackson was born in Uganda. She studied journalism and then worked as a sports reporter. She has read her poetry across the UK, and she has published an outstanding book called Moving a Country, which inspired one of our Canterbury Festival events. Jade Amoli Jackson also shared her personal story about her husband, sister, and father, who were all killed during a period of internal conflict. And she escaped from captivity and sought refuge in 2001. Her children were taken from her and are still missing in Uganda. And here is a beautiful poem by the wonderful Jade Amoli Jackson. Can you all see the screen? Yes? Hello?
Hello, yeah.
You could all see it. Lovely. Okay.
Why I left. People ask me why I left the warm, evergreen brown of my blessed land, Uganda, where men get drunk, snoring like elephants, and rage at the relentless sunshine that burns their hearts. Where at dawn, they wake up and grab their horse for gardening, alongside the singing of wives who wake up the household, where shoeless children prepare for school with calves' feet cut by small stones and grass. Leaving my former country is a badge I wear, like a shining medal on my chest, a scar on my heart. I packed nothing except my empty brain, had nothing else to pack. When my country failed me, I failed it in return and loved it even more. Why I left the warm, evergreen brown of my blessed land, its tall trees, I will not lie. I answer, it let me and others down. It is the only truth I have, the only truth there is. Thank you.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. I know we're way over time, but do you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share, ask our panel? If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box or say it out loud.
Could I just say what an absolutely amazing meeting this. I think everybody's kind of overwhelmed by what we've seen, what we've heard and seen. It's been a terrific meeting, and all the contributors have been just absolutely amazing. And you know, to pick a question out at this stage, I think probably we're all stunned and just so impressed by everything we've heard. And you know, it's going to, you think you're beyond actually being moved, but it's like it's been remarkable. Thanks very much for putting this together. That's all I'd like to say. And well done, everybody. Well done indeed.
Thank you, Pete, for being a part of all the organising and presentation. Kate, did you have something you'd like to share?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Please go for it.
Sorry, am I unmuted?
Yep, you're fine.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. It's been amazing. And thanks Barrier for so much hard work in organizing this and getting some really great speakers. You know, you've done so well, and the technicalities with the Zoom, which just terrify me. But I did have just one question, which was about JR. Are the barristers still here? Yeah. Because Leonie said something about JR, and I understood from another meeting that I went to that this government want to limit JR. What's happening there? Can you just tell us? Because you were saying it's a really good weapon for us, and we can help people like you fight back, you know.
Yeah, so briefly, there was a consultation there've been several consultations. There was a consultation with an independent review panel handpicked by the government, and the government put out a call for evidence, which was only really directed towards government departments, with some very loaded questions saying, don't you agree that judicial review is very, very difficult for public authorities to manage, and it's full of pesky lawyers asking questions that waste your time? That review reported back and didn't actually find that there was any problem with judicial review, surprisingly. And so the government responded by launching another consultation, this time directed very much towards removing access to judicial review. So that's ongoing. I think it's probably quite likely that the government will have a stab at taking judicial review away, and that will be probably by both limiting the scope of judicial review, so what questions can be asked of what authorities, and probably sort of fiddling around the edges with trying to prevent judicial review in certain situations. It's very difficult legally. There have been lots of attempts over the years to include judicial review, and the courts have been rightly very resistant to that. So I think I'm actually feeling relatively okay. I think the bill will probably get through the Commons because of the government's majority, but I think there are some very serious concerns about because the constitutional importance of judicial review, that limiting access to it is actually an issue that affects everyone across the political spectrum. So there's going to be, I think, some very robust opposition to the bill, particularly in the Lords. So we'll kind of see what happens with that. I mean, the more effective way for the government to remove access to judicial review for pesky claimants is simply to do what they have already done, which is to cut legal aid, because legal aid for claimants is we're already working at risk. So if we don't get permission on a claim, we don't get paid for any of the work done up to that point. And I think that's probably what the government will fall back on, is just cutting progressively legal aid, because that's a much easier sell than overtly denying access to judicial review. But I don't know whether Shushin's got different views.
No, I agree. I mean, in the typical approach of this government is to not coordinate. So they have the Ministry of Justice second review on judicial review generally, but they also, in the new immigration plan, proposed some of the aspects on costs, which Leonie has just touched on. So they were trying to propose fixing the costs for immigration-related judicial review, a proposal that had been already rejected in 2015 by a senior senior judge who was asked to review and consider fixed costs for judicial review, and had rejected it resoundingly. But they're now trying, but of course, you know, if they don't like the answer, they'll just try again. So that's currently where things stand. So, you know, I like Leonie, I'm cautiously optimistic that access to justice is a fairly basic principle that even the most conservative judges would balk at reducing. And certainly in the Court of Appeal just earlier last year, even though the court is sometimes resistant to immigration-related judicial reviews and appeals, they nevertheless, in the context of the Home Office's removal policy, found that whatever the merits of someone's case, they have an inviolable right of access to the courts. So that's kind of the base principle, and judicial review is founded on that. So I think I would agree with Leonie on cautious optimism on that front.
Well, thanks. If you need us, let us know. You know, anything we can do if there's some kind of campaign. Thanks a lot.
Any other questions? Lovely.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Bahria,
Yes.
thanks very much for organising this event. It's been fantastic.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you.
And I'm sure everybody who's attended has learnt a lot from today.
Lovely. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much, everyone. And I just want to again thank all of our speakers today for accepting our invitation. Professor Katona, Shushan, Leonie, Faith, and thank our caseworkers for all of the amazing work, and our trustees, Andrew, Anthony, Chris, and I'm forgetting someone. Who am I forgetting, Chris?
What's that? Auntie, you said who? Andrew?
And Robert.
Chelsea.
Rupert.
Sorry, Rupert. I'm so sorry. Yes, I have a mind blank. Rupert, who actually helped with preparing and organising the legal team, who guided us quite a lot today. What I'm doing again is in the chat box, you will see the letter that we have composed for our MP. But if you can, please, if you're happy and are against the immigration plans, please do sign that if you are from Canterbury and Whitstable. If you are not from Canterbury and Whitstable, you can copy that letter and send it to your own MPs. I'd also like to spend today to point out that it's the 15th of May 2021, which is Nakba Day. 73 years ago today, Palestine entered what can be defined as hellish experience. Today is Nakba Day, and there is a global rally. I've put that into the chat box. It's at 5 p.m. our time. There will be a global online rally. If you are in Canterbury, right now in front of HSBC, there is a rally in support of those in Palestine still fighting for freedom, justice, and equality. I will go there now, so please do join me if you are in Canterbury. If not, do look up the Palestine campaign, because there will be a rally in your area. If you are going to go to the global online rally this evening, there'll be a lineup of amazing speakers, poets, music, in solidarity with the people of Palestine. So thank you so much again to all of you for being here. It was an absolute delight to have this moment with you. It's a sad, we've heard a lot of sad and difficult stories to bear witness to, but like all of our speakers have said today, through being a collective in solidarity, we can concretely and actively make a difference in the lives of people who are suffering right now as we speak. So thank you so much. And on behalf of Kent Refugee Help, I'd like to thank you all for your support. I'd also like to make a point that I forgot to mention. Originally, this was going to be our AGM, but as you've noticed, we're way over time. But there's far too much going on for us to be able to also do the AGM business. So what we will be doing is our AGM business, where we'll meet our patron and all of the business, but lots more exciting talks that will happen. We're preparing for that. Will be in the summer. So please do watch this space. And thanks again for being here and confirming that we're not alone in this struggle. So maybe I'll see you in front of HSBC in about 10 minutes. If not, 5 p.m. on the online rally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.